Welcome to the Consumer Code Show, where we believe that humans are incredible and we are living in a first era in history where behavioral data and AI have hit scale so we can go from consumer insight to business activation in no time. In this show, we explore the world of retail through the lens of demography, cartography, ethnography, and the economy. So without further ado, let's get into this episode. All right, everyone, we are welcoming Michael Weiss to the show today. Michael, I'm so excited to have you on because in all my research in geodemographics, specifically in the United States, whenever I ask about the beginning of geodemographics, there's two names that come up. One, Jonathan Robin, and the other one is Michael Weiss. And that's for a good reason, because you have written extensively on geodemographics. I've got this, The Clustering of America, written in 1989, the year that I was born, where you physically visited all 40 of the first Claritas customers or clusters, and then the clustered world, which was more recent, and you also have latitudes and attitudes. So you've got great experience in geodemographic segmentation, and I can't wait to talk to you about the origins of geodemographics in the United States and your actual experience meeting these people. But let's start in the beginning. How did you get involved in geodemographics?
Well, the story for me starts in 1983. First, the industry had been around for about 10 years, and I read a short profile of a man they called the King of the Zip Codes in the Washington Post. And it was about this social scientist who had created this segmentation system that looked at the country not as 50 states, but as 40 different lifestyle types. And I thought this was just an unusual way of looking at the country. So I pitched a profile about the founder of this new industry, Jonathan Robin. And pitched it to an airline magazine. In the old days, a lot of airlines had their own in-flight magazines. And I did this for American Airlines. And I just had a wonderful time interviewing Jonathan and learning about this new industry. And that magazine article turned into one book and eventually 3 books, and really sort of changed my career.
So when you met Jonathan, what was unique about him? What stood out to you in your first conversation?
Jonathan was just an amazing man. He was brilliant. He was funny. In one breath, he would quote a 19th century Italian poet, and in the next, he would be talking about R. Crumb, the underground comic artist. And he was just a wonderful interview. And when you're a journalist, you're not always looking for a good quote, but you're looking for sort of facts to back it up. And Jonathan had access to all this data, and he would tell me stories that the data showed up to him and then comment on them. And he was just fun. So he would give me counterintuitive kinds of findings from the data that he was looking at. So I remember one early case study when he was looking at how people bought condoms, that the highest concentration of communities that bought condoms had nothing to do with men. It was all about single women. And basically, women didn't trust their boyfriends and their husbands to be in charge of birth control. So they were sort of the secret factor on condom sales in the country, which was pretty shocking to me. Instant mashed potatoes. You think, okay, who buys instant mashed potatoes? And he would say, well, you would think it would be upscale single parents who just wanted a quick sort of meal they could prepare for dinner. And in fact, it turned out to be concentrated in the South, older Southern downscale people who may not have been exposed as much to, sort of the whole foods revolution of healthier eating and not processed foods. So there were those kinds of findings that I just sort of fell in love with and kept going back to Jonathan over and over for stories and information and eventually material for books.
You know, sometimes the insights that you get from these geodemographic systems are counterintuitive, like the single women in condoms. And then sometimes they are as banal as possible, where it's like, these people just don't know that there's other options besides mashed potatoes for a carbohydrate. But you know, both cases that they're true, and like they do tell a pretty cool story about people. I'm curious if you could walk a little bit through Jonathan Robbins' history, like why was it him? Why did he come up with geodemographics?
Well, it wasn't just the fact that he was a Renaissance man. His real specialty, and he was a kind of computer wizard early on, he loved taking large data sets and boiling them down into fewer data points that could then correlate into help solving problems. So his first job, this was all happening in the early 70s when the census for the first time was put on magnetic tape. So he was able to get access to all kinds of census data and boil it down to try to solve problems. And I know that one of his early jobs was working for the Office of Economic Activity, basically the poverty program, where he ranked communities, counties all throughout the country according to their poverty index. And this was to help the agency decide where they should be targeting poverty programs. And then he sort of figured out a way of correlating census data with zip codes. Zip codes were first becoming popular in the 1960s. And at that time, companies were getting point of sale data, they were getting marketing research data, survey data, and then tagging every respondent by zip code. So he was able to link census data and zip code information to then merge them and create a segmentation system. So all this data to show that there were 40 distinct kinds of Americans from the wealthiest neighborhoods in the country down to the poorest. And he turned that into a business and ultimately became an entire industry.
You know, it's fascinating to me, and I haven't figured out why this is necessarily, but there is a similar story in both the development of Mosaic with Richard Weber and then the development of PRIZM with Jonathan Robin. And you had this situation where essentially zip code tabulated information becomes computerized. That's step one that leads to innovation. Step two is both of them were studying deprivation in some form. So Jonathan Robbins was hired kind of at a mass scale to study deprivation. And then Richard Weber was hired at a smaller scale to figure out what types of services to deliver to certain LSOAs, which is essentially like kind of a block group in the United States. Do you have any guess on like, why was it that led them to this?
Well, if it's sort of there's some debate about who was the first person who came up with the geodemographic system. And I like to think that there's about a half a dozen people who were sort of working in this area and coming up with sort of very similar kinds of structures. I've always considered Jonathan to be the father of geodemography. But in England, Richard Weber was also doing very similar work and really creating a whole similar kind of segmentation system, but taking it further in some respects. Because he did create Mosaic when he was working at Experian in
that came
London,
later after Acorn, yeah.
And Nottingham and Acorn, exactly. And the interesting thing about that was he even developed a kind of global Mosaic system for multiple European countries. So it was a system with 12 different lifestyle types that he thought were somewhat universal for many European countries. And even though he had Mosaic segmentation systems for Spain and Italy and Scotland, each one customized for the country, there was also a kind of global segmentation system that he developed. So the fact that they were both working on deprivation and poverty programs first was a surprise. I had interviewed Richard several times and went to Nottingham, England, and he actually gave me a tour of London, showing me, well, this is a neighborhood of the chattering classes, and this is subtropia when he was talking about sort of suburban middle-class kinds of areas. But I didn't really know that much about the deprivation aspect of his background. That's interesting to me.
Yeah, so I just think that you're right. There's probably multiple people. It probably wasn't just Richard and Jonathan. There's probably a lot of people kind of working on a similar thing in the beginning, and I just think it's sort of innate, and it's capturing this truth about people that their geography matters a lot. Like where you choose to live really matters, and I think people totally underappreciate it.
Right. And it's really this whole idea. There are several principles that are really behind geodemographic systems. One is that birds of a feather flock together, and that is people of similar demographics tend to live with people like themselves. And part of it has to do with housing costs. You can't really live in a wealthy neighborhood unless you have a lot of money. You can't have a lot of money without a lot of education to have the skills to get well-paying jobs. And another one is that basically people who have similar demographic backgrounds tend to behave similarly in the marketplace. So if you were living in a place like Georgetown in Washington, D.C., a very upscale area, it's classified money and brains, very high educational levels, high levels of affluence, and basically they're buying similar products. So you could go to sleep in Georgetown, wake up in Palo Alto, California, also designated money and brains, and basically the lifestyle's the same. They're reading the New Yorker. They're driving imported SUVs. They're buying cocktail nuts at very high rates, presumably because they have a lot of cocktail parties, along with their other educated friends. And you see this pattern repeated over and over in all of these 40 different lifestyle types that the segmentation system revealed.
This kind of is a good segue to get into the early days of geodemographics. Who were the early players involved in U.S. geodemographics?
Well, as I said, I would sort of name about a half a dozen people that I thought were some of the early pioneers. Jonathan Robin founded Claritas in 1971, and then the first PRIZM system came out in 1974. But he was really one of only 4 people who really just created this unbelievable company and industry. Another person was Sam Barton. And Sam Barton basically grew up in consumer segmentation or consumer research. His father invented the consumer panel back in the 1940s. So Sam grew up in it, and he was sort of the Flash of Claritas. By the way, that's Latin for clarity. That was the name of the company. Sam
Barton, real quick, when you said his dad developed the consumer panel, was that like a Nielsen panel? What was that?
No, in the 1940s, they would have, for the first time, they would have a panel of people and survey them. And he was the first person to really, it's almost like a massive focus group on what kinds of products they liked. And that was Sam Barton's father. So Sam grew up in this, but he was the Flash. He would show up at client meetings driving a sports car, and he had capes and $1,000 suits. He was a bit of a character. And then there was Bruce Carroll, who was sort of just a brilliant entrepreneur. And he would really go to the client meetings and lock down the contracts. He was the business guy, and he went on to lead a number of companies that had segmentation systems. He went to start CompuSearch in Canada. They had a site segmentation system, and he went to Arkansas to start the Personics segmentation system at a company called Axiom.
Okay.
There was a real character named Robin Page, who was an old Coca-Cola ad guy, and he was just the wordsmith of the group, and he named all the segments, and he named the products, and he was just so much fun because the names were so clever. Before geodemographic segmentation, sort of personas and lifestyle types of consumers had designations like the 1A persona or the 2B, a customer. And Robin came up with shotguns and pickups and blue chip blues and blue collar nursery. And he named them in all these different segmentation systems. And I used to say, Robin was the equivalent of someone in Detroit naming every car model for Ford, GM, and Chrysler. I mean, he was that sort of key persona in the early days. I also think that Richard Webber, the work that he was doing in the UK with Mosaic and Acorn, was really cutting edge kinds of things, and he was really one of the early pioneers. And then lastly, I'd like to name one or two more people who came out of CompuSearch. CompuSearch was bought out around 2000 or so. And there was a legendary math wizard named Jan Kessel, who was an entrepreneur and was working at CompuSearch, and just a brilliant woman. And after the company, CompuSearch, was bought out, she and several other people started their own company called Environics Analytics. And she and Tony Lee, who was just another math genius, really built this company from the ground up. And in 2004, they called me when they were talking about building a new segmentation system. And I went up to help them build it because I had done all this writing about PRIZM. And I just fell in love with them, and I never left. I worked with them for 15 years, and she was always just the smartest woman in the world in the room. Anytime you were in a room with Jan Kessel, you knew you were going to have a very challenging, exciting sort of discussion. She was just great. And I'm still, a great fan.
I've met Jan, and I guess my reaction to Jan was, and if Jan, if you're listening to this, now you know, I was so intimidated by her at first. I was like, oh my gosh, she had the same reaction as you. She is so smart.
And she was also really an empire builder in the sense when I started the company in 2004, there were only 8 people. And when I left 15 years later, there were 200 staff members, and, their revenues were over $40 million. It was just an unbelievable. And she's now really one of, the great leaders of the entire Canadian marketing industry. It isn't just geodemographics. It's just all of marketing. She's an unbelievable person.
And Environics is just so highly respected in Canada, just for accuracy. Just like I can't imagine like if a company being rated any higher than unrespect. So that's cool.
I've also moved into the U.S. And are really one of the largest segmentation marketing analytics companies in the entire North America.
Some of the things you're talking about, I had never heard of. So I've never heard of Sam Barton, Bruce Carroll. You mentioned Robin Page in one of our conversations, and then Jonathan Robbins. So those feel like kind of the original fearsome four of the group. Of that group, I mean, this is a long time ago. How many of these guys are still alive?
Well, Jan very much so. The other early folks from Claritas have all passed. And Sam Barton is still around and still working in the industry as well. And of course, Richard Webber is there.
Yep.
Some of the early people, this is 40 years ago, we're really talking about.
Yeah, very cool. Very cool. Boy, that was an eye opener for me because there's new names I have never heard before. So that was really cool. Okay, let's talk about their earliest applications. So what were the first applications that you saw in either the corporate or the political world?
Okay, so this would be now the late 1970s. And the earliest uses, at least of the Claritas' PRIZM system, were magazines, Time and Newsweek, because they were looking to create sort of affluent, targeted editions of their very mainstream sort of magazines. So Time had a Z edition, so they could sell ads just for a more upscale reader. And they were able to take their lists and PRIZM segment them to some of the upscale segments. When Colgate-Palmolive wanted to launch a new detergent, they went to Claritas and got lists of young family segments and sent out these samples of detergents to the family neighborhoods of Blue Collar Nursery and Blue Chip Blues. Soon, political people, pollsters, political strategists were seeing that you could not only just sell soap, but you could also sell politicians using the segmentation system. So the governor of West Virginia at the time, Jay Rockefeller, was working on his campaign, excuse me, and the issue was, coal is very big in West Virginia, but it really meant different things to different voters. So for the voters in a segment like mines and mills, which were downscale, mostly heavy industry people, they used a message of coal being good for jobs, and if you voted for Jay Rockefeller to get new jobs. Whereas in a segment like towns and gowns, where West Virginia University and Morgantown and some of the more upscale communities were located, Jay Rockefeller used a message of coal means energy independence, and it's good for our state for that kind of message for getting more clients and digging and trying to find more coal seams. And it really helped him out because he was actually the underdog in that race. This would be 1980, and he was victorious in that campaign. So gradually, some of the national political parties, I remember going to a meeting in the 80s, maybe 90s, with the Democratic National Committee, and they were using the segmentation systems of PRIZM for looking for swing voters because the traditional political parties were sort of fragmenting, and Democrats didn't all behave in the same way, and Republicans didn't all behave. But if you were looking for young family, conservative families in second cities in the U.S., you could do that using PRIZM segments to try to get to the more fragmented versions of American households and voters.
So let's talk about your big adventure, your big trip. So at some point you're working with Geodemographics and you have this idea to actually go physically visit all of these clusters and meet these people. When did that idea happen? Like, what occurred to you? Like, this is a story that needs to be told.
Well, I was really, as a journalist, you always are fascinated by real people and the stories they tell. And here I had access to all this data. And I sort of wanted to know, did it really reflect a new way of looking at America, not as 50 states, but as 40 different lifestyle types? So since I had access to it, and Claritas was very willing to open their computers to me, they created an itinerary for me. And basically what they did was they ranked every lifestyle segment by zip code to very pure versions. 100% of all residents in a particular zip code were urban Gold Coast or Money and Brains or Blue Blood estates, on down to 10% or 5% or 0%. So I really knew where communities were that highly represented. They were archetypical versions of these different lifestyle types. And then I did what any good journalist would do. I started making phone calls to try to find typical residents in those lifestyle types. And I knew who the typical ones were. I had all the census data. I had 34 different measures of census behavior: family type, education, affluence level, average number of kids they had. And then I had access to all this data, marketing research data, knowing what they ate, what they drank, surveys of what their social values were, what they thought about, what magazines they read, what TV shows they watched. So I started making phone calls. I would find a place like Wheaton, Illinois, which was a kids in cul-de-sacs neighborhood type. And I would call the local mayor, and I would call a librarian in this particular zip code, clergy members, principals of schools. All these people really knew a lot about the people they served, the citizens they served. And I would interview them and get some really great comments. And then I'd say, listen, can you turn me on to several residents who are typical? And I would then give them the census data, and they would then give me the names of 3 or 4 families, and I would go out and visit and interview these folks. And it was great fun. And, with every interview, I would go in with 30 or 40 questions about what they like to read and what they watch on TV and what they serve for dinner. And it was always fun to ask, what do you do on a Saturday night? And how do you spend your Sunday mornings? And they would give me a tour of their kitchens, and I would go into their pantries, and and their bedrooms. People are always putting stuff on, their nightstands and their coffee tables, so I could see exactly what they were reading and what they were doing and the kinds of cars they had in their garages. So I had a chance to be a real snoop. In my better moments, I could think of myself as a modern day, Alexis de Tocqueville or Charles Osgood, or, some of the people who actually went out years ago to interview people. And it was, and I traveled over 50,000 miles over a little over a year, and it took me basically a year to write up all the interviews and the notes and then profile every segment in my first book, The Clustering of America, using live voices merged with all the data that I had access to. So it was a sort of very holistic approach to looking at the country, and it was a real challenge and great fun.
Oh, it is. It's a monumental type project. And the picture that you were able to get of America and these snapshots, like I can't imagine anybody would have that sort of viewpoint. And that's just, I'm sure you were fascinating at cocktail parties. Absolutely fascinating.
I'm really good with, with a drink. I got a lot of very ridiculous tidbits that I can talk about. Who likes Twinkies and who eats Velveeta cheese, and that there's a mayonnaise line in America. And I think Hellman's is really popular in the South, and Miracle Whip is popular in the North. And, the early sales of Japanese cars created a Japanese smile along the coast. That was a high concentration of Japanese car sales, because initially that's where the ports were, where they were offloaded. And then the imported car lots were right closest to where they were downloaded, and that gradually moved into the Midwest. But in the early days, there was a Japanese smile, which you could see in the country, which showed the highest concentration of Japanese car sales.
That's fascinating. So maybe give us a few of those tidbits. What are the stories that really, since they were how many years out? We're more than 40 years out from this book.
Right.
What are some of the stories that have stuck with you?
Well, there was one when I was always wondering if the data were really true. I mean, they were really accurate. And I remember one story which really struck me. I was visiting the segment of Blue Chip Blues. Blue Chip Blues was the most popular segment, the largest segment in the 1980s. And it was a segment of middle-class, blue-collar families. I went to a place called Coon Rapids, Minnesota, and it's just filled with a lot of working class, but well-paid jobs. And I knew from my data, when I was asking about what are the popular recreational activities, that bowling was big. So I knew that, in fact, and I was getting a tour, and I was interviewing a woman, and she was telling me that she and her husband are really big on bowling leagues, and their kids bowl and they bowl. And when we got to their living room, on their mantelpiece, there was a 2-gallon bottle of cold duck. Now, cold duck is sort of a poor man's champagne. And they had won a big tournament, and they were given the gift of this, I don't know, maybe a $30 then bottle of cold duck. And they had it prominently displayed on their mantelpiece above the fireplace. And when I was saying, what is that about? And they told me the story, I just cracked up, because I knew from my data that they were really into bowling. And this was a perfect example of, what was going on.
Yeah.
I also, at one point, I went to a place called Kids in Cul-de-Sacs. And I was actually being interviewed. Sometimes I would go to a community And the local reporters would go, oh, we've got this guy doing this crazy project. Let's go interview him. And I knew that they were really big on SUV. This was also now an upscale white-collar family community. And I went right outside their garage, and I said, you know, if my data is correct, we're going to open that garage door, and there's going to be an SUV parked in the garage. And in fact, they opened it up, and it was, a Ford Econoline or something that just rolled out of the garage. And, that really hit home to me that this stuff really is, really right on. And I'll tell you one other sort of cute story. I guess would be considered cute. All right, there's a neighborhood type called shotguns and pickups. And I looked at some of the pure versions, and one was a community that anyone who's ever had Jack Daniels would know about, Lynchburg, Tennessee, which is the home, the distillery of Jack Daniels Distillery. So I went out there, tiny place, one blinking red light in the center of town. No building is over 2 stories. Mind you, this is 40 years ago I'm talking about. And I knew from the census data that the educational achievement was very low. A lot of families just thought that their kids should grow up and go into the same sort of working class kinds of employment that their parents did. And I was interviewing the librarian in Lynchburg, and she told me that when the library first had the opportunity to get Wi-Fi access for library patrons, the residents didn't want it. They voted it down. They just didn't think it was right for their community, for their value system. And, that's sort of a perfect example of how people felt that, education wasn't the be-all, end-all. Very low, even high school graduate rates in this sort of segment type. And I remember seeing a bumper sticker that, reflected this attitude. And the bumper sticker said, "My kid can beat up your honor student," which was, ironic and sad and funny at the same time. Anyhow, that's another story of just, what I would see on the road.
Man, just being on the road, you got such good firsthand experience. And I've heard just a few stories. So Richard Weber, in one of his segmentations, he actually went and took all the pictures first and built the segmentation second, which is so cool.
Oh,
and I
right.
think there's nothing, I mean, you can do all the surveys, you can do all the data in the world. Like, I get it. There's nothing quite like actually going there and meeting those folks. And I know my background in ethnography, I was doing the same thing as you doing, snooping, going into houses. And I think I was a bad interviewer. But I learned a lot from the things that people didn't say, like what was in their house. What was the house designed around? Like, it's so sad to me how many houses were designed around a television. Like, you could see all the furniture and everything led you to the pinnacle of the house, and the pinnacle was the television. But some houses were designed around bookcases. I'm sure that's not the case in the shotguns and pickups. It might be designed around the head of the deer that was recently shot. That is up on the mantelpiece. But it's so cool that you got that experience.
Well, I always noticed that actually in shotgun pickups, they had shotguns displayed and hanging in their bedrooms. I would have thought it would have been, around in the den or the fireplace, but they did have them hanging in their bedrooms. And by the way, I did take photographs in every place I went. And when I was first talking to the folks at Claritas about this project, Robin Page proposed he and I getting a recreational vehicle and driving around, and he would do videos of everything while I was doing my interviews. And it was just cost prohibitive. I mean, it was just a crazy idea. But there really is a way, sort of a market for doing that. And when I came back, I gave a lot of speeches where I did have photos in my slide presentations. And Environics Analytics has actually done a number of videos of all their segments. Their staff members have gone out with video cameras, and they've created personas of every one of their segment types. So their clients can really see little video vignettes of the different lifestyle types. So, your idea of going out as an ethnographer really dovetails this whole idea of trying to image the different kinds of people that represent these lifestyle types.
Yeah, because there's one thing in getting it just from a data standpoint. Like you can get, I got 20% of my customers are in this segment A01. Great. But do you get that at the heart? Because at the heart is where the creative comes from, right? It's like a tension that's built up when you understand these people and what they need, and then like the right creative will come out from that tension. Um, I'm curious the transition. So you met all these folks, and then you get this call from Jan and Tony Lee, and they're like, come up and help us build this. I would love to look at your career at Environics. What were you doing, and how have you seen segmentation change throughout the years?
Well, I sort of went up and did this project to help name and image the first PRIZM C2 segmentation system. And I just fell in love. I fell in love with the people who were working on this. I fell in love being on the inside. I'd always been on the outside as a journalist looking in. And I like being on the inside. And I never left. There was an early conference we had, and Jan introduced me as the vice president of marketing. And it was the first time I heard that title, and I said, okay, I'm vice president of marketing, which was wonderful. And I just stayed. I went up and I never left. I worked out of a home office here in outside Washington. And I would go up for 3 or 4 days a month for meetings. I had a small staff of 4 or 5 great folks, and I ended up naming and imaging their other segmentation systems. They had a Wealthscapes. I named products like Envision, which is an unbelievable dashboard of all the data and analytics you need to reach your customers and your markets, not only in Canada, but in the US. And I watched the industry grow from the inside, and it was just a great experience.
So it sounds like you did naming of the segments. Did you also write the pin portraits of the segments as well?
Oh yeah, I named them and imaged them. So imaging them was really, I want to say like 500 to 1,000 words, along with the data of what they, high rates for consuming this and low rates for consuming that. So it was really the kind of stuff I was doing in a book level for the company. And as VP of marketing, I organized press conferences whenever we launched a new product. I was able to help name a bunch of products. And that was really just a treat to be able to do that, to have that responsibility. And, these are people I worked with from, the ground up when it was a very small company, and just watched it grow in a whole new generation of analysts and marketers and project managers come in and just see the great growth. And we would have these massive conferences of 400 people who would show up of their clients. And it was always the clients making presentations of how they were using the data in their line of work, which was really what you wanted, because, this isn't rocket science, but it's new for a lot of people. And, early on, when they were trying to create a market for this stuff, they would go to magazines and try to get their account reps and their ad people to use segmentation data. And it was a challenge, because a lot of ad people think that the creative types have all the messages they need to try to sell their products and their services. And this was really a whole radical way of thinking that, hey, forget your creative, let it be data-based, use data, use analytics, use hard numbers for creating and finding your customers. And, when I started in this field, I remember interviewing the CEO of a fashion chain, a very small fashion chain. And I remember asking him how he selected the sites for his stores for selling his women's fashion stuff. And he said, well, I just go nearby wherever my wife likes to shop. Okay. All got nothing to do with data, nothing to do with analytics. Now you fast forward 40 years ago, he'd be out of business. I mean, you really have to use all the different marketing analytics and data tools in the toolbox to really survive in today's kind of marketplace. And a company like Environics Analytics sells predictive analytics, and they sell wealth for the affluence level of your target customers. They do incredible kinds of mapping and sell mapping software with their products. And it's just this whole sort of holistic approach to finding customers that are really needed in today's kind of marketplace. And that's exactly how their industry has grown.
As you've seen the innovations on top of geodemographic segmentation come throughout the years, what do you think is the most impactful? Because at first, this just started as a literal database. Then the first innovation was applying survey data to it. Maybe another was mapping. Maybe another was appending customer data. As you've seen that, what are the big things that you feel like, okay, this has made it significantly more useful?
Well, early on, PRIZM didn't really have a lot of social value or psychographic data in their stuff. Environics Analytics, their real, one of their first innovations was merging with social values data that another company at Environics, who was an umbrella organization for several companies. And Environics did have a social values survey that was very popular that Environics Analytics was able to merge in with their segmentation system. So that was really an important way of getting the values of to move that in, merge that in with what people are buying, and then you get a sense of why they're doing it. This idea of a data dashboard of using sort of canned algorithms for coming up with ways of doing site location analysis. The site location mapping that Environics was doing was just amazing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One of the more recent things that I think is just incredible is what they're doing with mobile analytics. And mobile analytics was really, and by the way, the main reason why I think it became such a popular kinds of marketing system was that they didn't have to use private data. They didn't have to get down to the individual household to be very effective at reaching their customers in their markets. All this data early on was at the zip code or census block group or the census tract level, and you didn't have to worry about the strict privacy laws that you have in Europe and in Canada, which are more stringent than we have in the U.S. And so this was really very powerful to be able to have an effective targeting tool that didn't require to get into concerns about privacy. So this new mobile analytics is able to track where customers are coming from at a store, at a mall. They could geofence a convenience store and know exactly where the customers were coming from throughout the course of a day. So when they're out-of-home screens inside the convenience store, they could show different ads, knowing that in the morning, a young influentials person was going shopping, or later in the day, a cosmopolitan elite person would show up. So it's really very, very powerful that companies can go after different customers at different times, and that you can geofence around the site and then create a target area at 1 mile and 3 miles and 5 miles and show different times of day when different kinds of customers are coming in. So the industry, especially the Environics that I know about, has just continued to evolve and get more and more precise in its targeting abilities without getting into concerns about privacy and privacy sensitivities, really, of customers and governments.
I think that's such a utility of geodemographics is that it is effective. And two, you don't necessarily have to get down at that household level if you don't want to. You can still be effective at the census block group level, which is very descriptive of those people. And like we can look at the data and see, yes, if you target based on the census block group, based on those people there, personalize it'll perform better than obviously not doing any at all. Do you have other thoughts on why is geodemographics stuck around? Like this is developed so long ago, and we have had so many innovations since then. I am sure there's many years where people are like, oh, maybe that we won't be using geodemographics anymore. But we are this close. And some people would argue we're already here, that we have general artificial intelligence, but we're close. We're very close. And people are still using geodemographic systems. Why is that?
Well, because I think geodemographics today, the technology at least, is really very close to artificial intelligence. I mean, you're talking about using algorithms and bringing together all different data sets. You first of all, companies have a lot of their own data in their own data silos in their own departments, and they're able to merge that to cross-tab it with a lot of the geodemographic segments to create just much more powerful kind of segmentation systems. So I think, geodemographic segmentation systems are really, they've evolved to the point where they're at the edge of artificial intelligence or really using very similar kinds of technologies to really make their material and to make their data so powerful and so valuable even today.
Is there ways that geodemographics changed throughout the years that were surprising to you, or any specific ways where you're like, I think it's going to go this way and it didn't?
Well, I want to say early on, for about the first 10 years in the 80s for me writing about it, I always thought that geodemographic systems would take off a lot faster than it really did. And I think early on, geodemography was sort of looked at as a stepchild of marketing. It really didn't have the acceptance because, at least in the ad industry, so many people still trusted their guts and still trusted their creative people to come up with messages and ways of marketing their information. And they thought, okay, well, that data is kind of cool, but we have people that we're paying for on staff and consultants and people who don't need data, that it was expensive or it was hard to work with, or we had our own people who were creative types who could do it. And I think it was really a slow slog for the account reps at Claritas and at Environics and all the geodemographic industry companies to really move and get more and more acceptance faster than it actually did. And that's why I think actually Environics was so smart to have the case studies of their clients showing off what they were doing, innovative ways they were using it to really get people to adopt it more. And let me just do a quick tangent. I haven't really talked too much about nonprofit or government uses of the segmentation data, and they have done some unbelievable things. There was a London, Ontario fire department that actually did a segmentation of profiles of where fires were happening. Grease fires in kitchens, and brush fires in gardens and areas. And they were then able to come up with billboard ads targeting the different segmentations, the different segments where these different kinds of fires were taking place. And in areas where a lot of kitchen fires were taking place, they had a billboard with someone at a stove and the fire coming out of a greasy pan or something. And in another area where there were different kinds of fires taking place, they had a whole other billboard that they were using. The Georgia Department of Health, they were worried about levels of obesity in the state, and they actually did obesity maps for the entire state of Georgia. And then they went out and targeted programs to try to get people to do more exercise and eat healthier and do these sort of things. And I loved hearing about the kinds of case studies where people were doing a lot more really creative things with geodemographic systems and coming up sort of doing well by doing good using the segments.
You know, it's really cool to hear. And when you think about it, it's very simple. So if you're trying to predict a purchase, that's a behavior. And most people, to be honest, with geodemographic systems, are trying to predict a purchase, or in case of politics, they're trying to predict a vote. And a purchase is just a vote. But this, what we're talking about, it's still a behavior. So obesity is a series of habits and behaviors. A kitchen fire could be, and I'm sure they discovered this, it's a very different behavior than somebody that is in shotguns and pickups and has a lot of bonfires. And then it's a totally different way of approaching it as a fireman too. That's really cool.
Yes, and that's really where there's been a lot of growth in the acceptance and the use of data. I think a lot more nonprofit and government leaders recognize that what has been used for a long time in the corporate world is really something they can adopt and use to great effect. Blood drives, I know, in Canada for reaching out to blood donors are very targeted now in going after different people through their government agencies.
So last question for you. You've been in this industry in a long time, but now you're on the other end of it. As you look back and you think about your involvement with geodemographics, how do you think that it's changed you?
How's it changed me?
Yeah, how's it changed you?
I am also a lot more data-driven. When I look at an ad, the first thing I think about is who the target audience is and whether I think the message has been developed by a company that cares about data and has used analytics to find that person, or is still using their creative, and putting a fancy car on top of a skyscraper and going around in figure eights on top of a some sort of creative sort of approach or data. So yeah, there's that. I also think about how the uses can really help. I know that there's a college, Hood College in Frederick, Maryland, that actually assigns its college students based on the segment where they're coming from. And the thinking being that people coming from the same lifestyle type will have fewer conflicts of, interests or attitudes, and they'll be, happier and less likely to want to drop out.
That's really cool. And in my own personal experience with this is I met my wife at Xavier University in Cincinnati, but I'm originally from a very small farm town. And I just noticed something unique about her. That we seem to be on the same page with a whole lot of stuff, and like in a very special way. And then come to find out, she is from the exact same segment that I had came from. And so there was a reason that we totally understood that when we grew up on Fridays, it was chicken noodle soup, or it was a tuna noodle casserole. Like, we had these exact same experiences that no one else had in the city because we came from the same segments. And it just shows you how powerful this is. It's powerful enough to facilitate a love connection, which I'm very thankful for.
Well, I don't think your story is in any way unique. I mean, I think a lot of people first end up finding their mates in college, gravitating to the same kind of college with similar kinds of students, and falling in love because you're meeting someone who has very similar values.
Well, I didn't think that we'd end on this, but it's appropriate because Valentine's Day is tomorrow. Michael, thank you so much for spending the time with me. This has been eye-opening to me, and I'm feeling like I get to touch the origin of this industry, and that is an honor to me. So thank you so much.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for your interest.